Another guest, who had remained on the sidelines throughout much of the evening, approached with a different kind of respect. They asked questions about his work and personal experiences. Curious to learn more about the man they had initially overlooked, he answered with patience, offering insights without any attempt to impress. His answers were simple, human, and relatable, revealing the depth of someone who had lived fully yet quietly, without needing the spotlight. As he moved through the room, he noticed how people's conversations had changed. Guests were no longer discussing superficial matters or mocking others. Instead, they spoke thoughtfully, considering their words more carefully. His presence had subtly shifted the energy of the party, creating a space where reflection, empathy, and genuine curiosity could take hold. It was not a dramatic transformation, but it was real and meaningful. The group of mockers, who had once been loud and confident, now appeared subdued. Some tried to speak, but their words were quieter, less certain. Others watched him with a mixture of respect and awkwardness. Realizing that their earlier behavior had been unnecessary and unfair, they had expected a reaction, a moment of weakness, and instead found someone entirely steady, who did not seek to retaliate or demean them in return. Throughout the evening, he had remained true to himself. He had not altered his behavior to impress anyone, nor had he reacted out of fear or anger. This consistency had become a silent lesson for everyone around him. People began to see that strength could exist in quietness, that power did not always need to be loud or aggressive, and that integrity could speak more loudly than any words of ridicule. By the time the party began to empty, he found a moment of solitude near the door. He watched as guests departed, many glancing back at him with newfound respect. He did not linger on their opinions or seek validation. He simply observed, aware of the subtle impact his calm presence had made. It was not about recognition, but about remaining authentic. Regardless of how others chose to behave, in the final moments, one of the guests approached him and thanked him. They said that witnessing his composure and honesty had been a lesson in patience and human dignity. They admitted that they had been too quick to judge, and that his behavior had caused them to reconsider their own actions in social situations. He accepted the gratitude quietly, offering a simple nod and a small smile. Another guest, who had been part of the initial mockery, lingered nearby, unsure how to leave the room. They seemed to wrestle with their feelings of embarrassment and respect. Finally, they approached and offered a quiet apology, acknowledging that their earlier actions had been unkind. He listened, his calm demeanor unshaken, and acknowledged their words with understanding. There was no anger, no humiliation, just a quiet human response that spoke volumes. As the last guest departed, the house grew quiet. The music stopped, the lights dimmed, and the rooms, once filled with chaos, returned to stillness. He took a deep breath, feeling the evening's events settle around him. There was a sense of closure, not from dramatic confrontation or loud resolution, but from the steady unfolding of human interaction and the quiet impact of remaining true to oneself. He reflected on the night and the lessons it had offered. He understood that the mockery, the laughter, and the initial judgment had been opportunities not to prove himself, but to show the value of calm, honest, and patient presence. By refusing to react in anger or shame, he had allowed others to see him fully, and in doing so, they had glimpsed their own behavior in a new light. The evening had revealed that real strength was not always loud or visible. It could exist in simple gestures, in quiet conversation, and in the choice to remain composed when provoked. He had demonstrated that one could be human, honest, and kind while still maintaining dignity, and that such a presence could quietly change the energy of a room, leaving a lasting impression on those who witnessed it. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, he felt a sense of calm satisfaction. The party had been a test of patience, of human character, and of self-control. He had faced mockery and judgment without losing himself, and in doing so, he had shown that authenticity and composure were forms of strength that could influence others more profoundly than any display of anger or pride. Walking down the quiet streets, he reflected on the lessons of the evening. The mockers would leave with their temporary amusement, but the subtle change in the way people thought and felt would remain. His calm had not only preserved his own dignity, but it offered a quiet lesson to everyone who had witnessed it. It was a reminder that how one responds to challenge, ridicule, or misunderstanding can define the impact one leaves on the world. By the time he reached his own home, the city around him was still and peaceful. The night had grown deep, and the events of the party settled in his mind not as a source of anger or frustration, but as a story of human interaction, patience, and quiet influence. He had been mocked, judged, and underestimated. Yet his calm reaction had not only preserved his integrity, but it changed the perception of those around him. He understood something essential. Life would always present moments of judgment and ridicule. People would always make assumptions based on appearance, demeanor, or first impressions. But the choice to remain calm, composed, true to oneself, had the power to change outcomes in ways that were subtle, meaningful, and enduring. The lesson of the evening would stay with him, as would the quiet impact he had made on those who had watched and listened. Sitting in his home, he allowed himself a small, contented smile. The night had been a test, but it had ended not with conflict, but with understanding, reflection, and respect. His calm had spoken louder than the mockery ever could, and that was a lesson he would carry with him always. And in that quiet understanding, he found peace, knowing that the strength of patience, authenticity, and composure could leave a lasting mark on the world, one interaction at a time. He continued to move around the room, observing quietly. Every interaction was met with patience and composure. Even when someone tried a final, particularly cruel remark, he did not respond with anger. He did not retreat. He remained present, steady, and composed. This consistency began to unsettle the mockers further. Their jokes seemed to lose meaning in the presence of his calmness. By the later hours of the night, the energy in the room had shifted noticeably. The mockers were no longer confident. The people who had once whispered and laughed at his expense were now hesitant, unsure how to act. His calm, steady presence had begun to dominate the social energy of the party, not through force, but through human dignity and patience, even in the midst of the laughter. The music and the chaos of the party, he remained grounded. His experience of being judged, misunderstood, and ridiculed had taught him something essential. The loudest voices did not always hold the most truth, and the reactions of others did not define him. By maintaining composure and honesty, he was not just surviving the evening, he was quietly transforming it. And in that transformation, subtle as it was, he understood something important. Real strength did not always shout. Real power was sometimes quiet, patient, and unwavering. And the ripples of that quiet power were beginning to show, changing the energy in the room and making even the most confident mockers question themselves. As the night continued, the party seemed to shift in ways most people did not fully notice at first. The loud laughter and constant chatter that had dominated the room were still there, but they no longer carried the same energy. Something in the atmosphere had changed, and it was because of him. His calm presence, steady and composed, had begun to influence the way others saw the room and each other. One of the guests, curious about his quiet confidence, decided to approach him. The conversation started with small talk, a polite exchange of words. But soon, the guest began asking questions that revealed genuine interest in his life. Unlike the mockers who only sought to humiliate, this person wanted to understand. He spoke honestly, sharing small details about his experiences, the work he had done, and the challenges he had faced. His words were simple, clear, and human, and they carried a depth that many had not expected. As the conversation grew, others nearby began to listen. Their attention shifted from gossip and teasing to curiosity. They wanted to know more about the person who had remained so calm despite the earlier mockery. Slowly, whispers spread around the room, not of ridicule this time, but of surprise and admiration. Some guests exchanged glances, realizing that their assumptions about him had been entirely wrong. The mockers, who had been so bold earlier, began to feel the shift. They noticed that the room was no longer laughing with them, and that some people were even questioning their behavior. The energy that had given them confidence was fading. Their attempts to provoke him had not only failed, but they had inadvertently drawn attention to their own insecurity. One guest, braver than the others, asked a question about a project he had completed, something he mentioned casually in conversation. He answered with humility, explaining his work in terms anyone could understand. He did not brag or boast. He simply shared the effort, the time, and the challenges involved. The more he spoke, the more respect he earned. People began to see him as not only calm, but knowledgeable and accomplished. The room began to change subtly. Guests who had previously whispered jokes now listened silently, intrigued by what he said. Some started to smile genuinely, a soft recognition of the truth that had been hidden beneath first impressions. Even the mockers began to feel uneasy. Their laughter had lost its sharpness, and their comments now sounded hollow in contrast to his steady presence and quiet competence. Few of the people who had not paid much attention before came forward. They asked questions, not to mock, but because they were genuinely curious. He answered with patience, never showing frustration or superiority. His honesty and humility drew people in, making them reflect on their own behavior. It was clear that his calmness was not weakness. It was strength, and it was reshaping the social dynamics of the party in a quieter corner. One of the earlier mockers tried a final attempt to regain control. They asked a pointed question about his personal life, aiming to embarrass him. He responded calmly, with no sign of anger or embarrassment. He shared a brief, honest story about a challenge he had faced, highlighting not misfortune, but the lessons he had learned. The story was simple, relatable, and human. It drew nods and smiles from people nearby, some even murmuring quietly to each other in admiration. The mockers' confidence began to crumble further. Their previous jokes, once sharp and cutting, now seemed petty and unnecessary. They realized that their attempts to dominate the room through ridicule had failed. The calm man who had once seemed quiet and out of place had shifted the energy, not by fighting, but by being fully himself. A few guests approached him individually, thanking him for his honesty, for the calm perspective he brought, and for showing strength without aggression. Their words were sincere, and he accepted them with a simple nod and a quiet smile. He did not seek attention or validation, but he acknowledged their appreciation gracefully. Each small interaction reinforced the idea that authenticity and composure could have a powerful impact on others. Throughout the evening, more truths about his life came to light. Stories he shared casually about his career, his hobbies, the quiet ways he contributed to his community began to circulate. People listened with interest, surprised at how much depth and experience he possessed. The room, once filled with judgment and laughter at his expense, was now filled with curiosity and respect. The mockers themselves became quieter. They observed how people reacted to his words and presence. Some tried to redirect the conversation or regain attention, but the room's energy had shifted. Guests were no longer focused on ridicule. They were paying attention to substance, to human experience, and to the calm strength he exuded. He moved through the room carefully, maintaining his calm demeanor. He did not seek out the mockers or confront them. He simply carried on, talking to those who showed genuine interest and remaining composed in the presence of those who had tried to undermine him. His steady presence acted as a quiet mirror, reflecting the true nature of everyone around him. Those who had mocked him now saw themselves in a different light, realizing how unnecessary and shallow their behavior had been by the later hours. The party had transformed in subtle but undeniable ways. The laughter was no longer sharp or cruel. It was softer, more thoughtful. Conversations shifted from gossip and superficial remarks to discussions about work, life experiences, and personal insights. His calm composure had created space for others to reflect, to listen, and to engage in ways that were more meaningful. He understood that the transformation was not just about him. It was about the choices people made in the moment. By remaining true to himself, he had given others the opportunity to see beyond first impressions, to recognize depth where they had expected simplicity. His presence had become a catalyst for reflection. The room had responded with curiosity, respect, and a new kind of energy. As the night drew on, he continued to move quietly among the guests. He noticed how some of the mockers were now engaging more cautiously, sometimes even listening rather than speaking. The shift in their demeanor was subtle, but it was there. They were beginning to understand, if only in part, the effect of calmness and authenticity. By the end of this part of the evening, the truth of his life and character had begun to shine through. Guests who had initially judged him harshly now saw him as a person of depth, strength, and dignity. The atmosphere of mockery and ridicule had been replaced, slowly but surely, by one of respect, curiosity, and reflection. His calm, honest, and composed behavior had changed not just how people viewed him, but how they viewed themselves and each other as the night began to wind down. The party's energy shifted from loud and chaotic to softer and more thoughtful. The music slowed, conversations quieted, and guests began to move toward the exits. Many still engaged in small groups discussing what had happened throughout the evening. The man who had been the target of mockery all night moved through the room quietly, as he always had, calm and composed. Observing the final moments of the gathering, he noticed the subtle changes in people's behavior. Those who had laughed at his expense earlier now approached him hesitantly, some with apologies, others with genuine curiosity. He received each interaction with a gentle nod or a small smile, never reacting with anger or pride. His calmness remained unchanged, and had begun to leave an impression that was quiet yet lasting. One guest, who had been particularly bold in mocking him earlier, finally spoke. Their voice was softer now, tinged with regret. They admitted they had misjudged him, that they had expected a reaction they could laugh at, and they acknowledged how his calm presence had made them reflect on their own behavior. He listened carefully, responding with quiet understanding, making no demand for forgiveness, but accepting their words with grace. The music changed, a slower, softer tune, giving a brief break from the constant noise. He moved toward a small table, picking up a drink without drawing attention. A woman standing nearby tried to smile at him, but quickly looked away. He nodded slightly, a simple acknowledgement of her gesture, then returned to observing the room. He realized that even small actions, like a polite nod or a calm response, had a quiet strength that most people underestimated. Someone from the mockers group tried again, this time making fun of the way he walked across the room. Others laughed, though it was not a hearty laugh, more like a reflex than genuine amusement. He paused for a moment, listening, then offered a polite smile, just a small one, almost imperceptible. It was not meant to challenge them, but it was not defeat either. It was a calm presence that said, without words, that he would not be rattled. A few guests began to notice his composure. Some whispered to each other, wondering how someone could remain so unaffected. It was unusual. Most people in the room responded quickly to teasing, either by mocking back, becoming defensive, or walking away. He did none of these things. He was still present and unbothered. The mockers grew frustrated. Their jokes became sharper, their laughter louder, their comments more direct. One of them asked a pointed question about his career, something meant to humiliate him in front of everyone. He answered simply, without pride or embarrassment. His words were calm, factual, and quiet. The effect was immediate. A few people stopped laughing. Realizing that their laughter no longer held power over him, he could feel the shift in energy around him. The room, once full of noise and judgment, now carried a subtle tension. Some of the people who had laughed first were uncertain how to continue. Some were still trying to maintain control, but the control had shifted, not through loud words, but through calm presence. Throughout all of this, he remained aware of himself. He felt the sting of their words, the sharpness of their attention, and the weight of being singled out. But he also felt something else, a sense of inner strength that came from years of facing judgment, criticism, and misunderstanding. He knew that reacting with anger or shame would only feed the spectacle. Staying calm, staying human, was the truer power. As the party moved into the later hours, the attention on him did not disappear, but it transformed. The mocking persisted, but now it was met with quiet observation. People began to see that he was not weak, that he was not easily shaken. The more they tried, the less effective their words became. His calmness, his patience, began to speak louder than any insult. By the end of this part of the evening, he had learned something about the people around him. He realized that much of the laughter, much of the teasing, was a reflection of insecurity, the need to feel bigger by making someone else feel smaller. He also realized that by refusing to participate in that cycle, he had created a different kind of power, one that was quiet, steady, and undeniable. Even as the music swelled and the party carried on, he remained grounded. He observed the room, not with judgment but with understanding. He noticed who watched him curiously, who whispered to themselves, who began to reflect silently on their own behavior. It was a subtle change, almost imperceptible to those caught up in the noise, but it was real. His calm reaction was starting to ripple through the crowd in ways no one could yet fully see. And in that moment, standing quietly, sipping his drink, he understood the truth of his own presence. Strength did not always roar. Sometimes it was quiet, patient, and steady. And that kind of strength could shift the energy of a room more than any argument or confrontation ever could. The party had been in full swing for several hours now, and the noise in the house had grown into a constant wave of music, chatter, and laughter. He had moved through the room a few times, still quiet, still observing. The mockers had not given up. In fact, their behavior had become bolder. It was as if the more they tried to provoke him, the more determined they became to see a reaction. The energy of the room seemed to feed off their cruelty. One of them, the most outspoken, approached him directly. The person leaned in with a smug expression, clearly expecting to get a rise out of him. "So what exactly do you do for a living?" the person asked, voice dripping with sarcasm. Others in the group leaned closer, their eyes bright with anticipation, eager to see him stumble. A few more guests gathered around, sensing the potential spectacle. He looked at the questioner calmly. His eyes did not flicker with annoyance or fear. He took a slow breath, letting the pause speak louder than words could. Then he answered simply, with clarity and honesty. There was no exaggeration, no need to defend himself. His voice was steady, quiet, and confident. It was not the loud answer the crowd expected, but it carried an undeniable weight. The room fell into an awkward silence for a moment. The mockers' smirks faltered. The group of people who had been ready to laugh suddenly hesitated. They realized that their target was not reacting in the way they had predicted. He was not embarrassed, flustered, or angry. He was just there, calmly answering the question, human and present. Seeing this, one of the group tried a different tactic. They made a remark about his appearance, gesturing at his simple clothing. The tone was meant to humiliate, to make him feel out of place. Others laughed along, some nervously, others with more genuine amusement. But he did not flinch. He acknowledged the comment with a polite nod, as if it were a passing remark rather than an attack. His calmness seemed almost strange to them, and it disrupted their rhythm. Another person, emboldened by the first laugh, tried to imitate the way he stood and walked. It was exaggerated and loud, intended to draw attention. He did not react. He did not straighten or change his stance. Instead, he continued moving slowly across the room, carrying himself with the same quiet dignity he had from the start. The imitator's energy, once sharp and powerful, began to look foolish in contrast. A few guests noticed the contrast and began to question the humor in what was happening. The music shifted again. A slower, more thoughtful tune that gave the room a brief pause. He stood near a corner where he could see most of the guests. He sipped his drink slowly, calmly, paying attention to the subtle reactions of the people around him. Some watched him closely, still unsure how to interpret his behavior. Others whispered among themselves, discussing how unusual it was to see someone remain so composed in the face of ridicule. He felt the sting of their words, but he did not let it overwhelm him. He knew that reacting in anger or frustration would only fuel their mockery. Instead, he focused on his own presence, on remaining steady and true to himself. Every glance, every whispered joke was met with calmness. His silence was not empty. It was filled with an unspoken strength that slowly began to affect the room. The mockers grew more impatient. Their comments became sharper, more direct, and more personal. One asked a pointed question about his education, trying to provoke shame. Another made a sly remark about how he must feel in a room full of people who were so different from him. Yet, he answered each question with simple honesty. He did not brag, and he did not apologize. He simply spoke in a calm, straightforward way that left little room for the mockers to exploit. The energy in the room shifted. The mocking had lost some of its bite. Guests who had been amused at first now looked on with curiosity. The group that had been confident and loud began to hesitate, unsure how to proceed. His composure had become a mirror, reflecting their insecurity and forcing them to confront their behavior. A few people approached him quietly, asking genuine questions, curious about his answers. They wanted to understand him, not mock him. For the first time, he saw a change in the way people perceived him. They were no longer just laughing at someone they assumed was weak or simple. They were seeing him as a person, someone with depth and dignity. The mockers, frustrated by their inability to provoke him, exchanged uneasy glances. They whispered among themselves, trying to figure out a new plan, but the room had already shifted. The presence he maintained made their previous attempts seem hollow and petty. His calmness had become a subtle force, reshaping the room's energy without raising his voice or demanding attention. At one point, the loudest mocker tried a direct challenge, asking something meant to embarrass him in front of everyone. He responded with honesty, speaking slowly and deliberately, making sure his words were understood. The room fell quiet again. Even those who had not been paying attention before now listened. The words were not meant to attack anyone else or to assert dominance. They were simply truthful, straightforward, and human. Some guests began to whisper among themselves, noting the change in the atmosphere. They realized that the calm, composed man who had seemed out of place was quietly asserting a different kind of authority, one that did not rely on volume, charm, or appearance, but on presence and honesty. It was a revelation to them, and it made many feel self-conscious about their own behavior. The invitation arrived late in the afternoon, slipped under the door without much thought. It was written casually, almost like an afterthought, and it invited him to a party that night. He read it twice, not because it was unclear, but because he was unsure whether he should go. He was not someone people usually noticed in social gatherings. He kept his life quiet and simple, and most evenings were spent alone with his thoughts rather than among crowds. He stood by the window for a long time after reading the invitation, watching the street below as people passed by. Cars moved slowly, horns sounded in the distance, and the sky carried the soft color of early evening. He told himself there was no harm in going. He had promised himself long ago not to avoid life just because it felt uncomfortable sometimes. So he decided he would attend, even if only for a short while. He did not own many clothes meant for parties. He chose a clean shirt, simple and faded from years of use, and a pair of dark trousers. There was nothing wrong with how he looked, but there was nothing flashy either. He checked himself in the mirror, adjusted his collar, and gave a small nod, as if reassuring himself that he was enough as he was. The party was being held at a large house across town. Music could be heard even before he reached the gate. Laughter spilled into the street, loud and careless. People stood outside in small groups, talking excitedly and checking their phones. As he walked past them, no one noticed him. He did not mind. In many ways, being unseen had always been easier. Inside, the house was bright and crowded. Lights reflected off glass and polished surfaces. The smell of food and perfume filled the air. Conversations overlapped, and the music played louder than necessary. He stepped inside slowly, unsure where to stand, holding his hands loosely by his sides. Most of the guests were dressed in expensive clothes. Their voices were confident, their laughter sharp and bold. They spoke about travels, work, and people he did not know. He stood near the wall for a moment, letting the noise wash over him. He felt slightly out of place, like someone who had entered the wrong room by mistake. A few people glanced in his direction. Their eyes moved quickly over his clothes, then away again. Some exchanged looks with each other, subtle but clear. He pretended not to notice, focusing instead on the music and the movement of people across the room. He picked up a glass of water from a table, took a small sip. It helped steady him. He reminded himself that he was not there to impress anyone. He was there because he had chosen to be, and that was enough. Nearby, a group of guests laughed loudly. Their jokes were exaggerated, meant to draw attention. One of them looked at him and whispered something to another person. They both smiled, not kindly. He heard his clothes mentioned, followed by quiet laughter. The words were not loud, but they were clear enough. He felt the familiar tightness in his chest. The feeling he had known since he was young. It was the feeling of being judged without being known. He took another sip of water and stayed where he was. He did not turn away. He did not react. More guests arrived, greeting each other with excitement. No one greeted him. A few people brushed past him as if he were part of the furniture. Still, he remained calm. He watched the room carefully, noticing how easily people smiled for each other and how quickly those smiles disappeared when they turned away. Someone bumped into him accidentally and muttered a half apology before walking off. He nodded, even though the person was no longer looking at him. His calmness came from long practice. Life had taught him that reactions often revealed more than words. As the evening went on, the music grew louder, and the conversations became less thoughtful. Laughter turned rough, and jokes became sharper. A few guests now openly glanced at him, no longer hiding their curiosity or their judgment. One person from the earlier group pointed at his shoes and laughed, not bothering to lower their voice. Another added a comment about how he looked like he had walked in from a different world. A few people laughed along, some out of cruelty, others simply because it felt easier than standing alone. He heard everything. His ears burned, but his face remained still. He did not clench his fists. He did not leave. He stood quietly looking at the floor for a moment, then lifting his gaze back to the room. There was a time in his life when he might have responded with anger or shame. Those days were long behind him. Experience had shaped him differently. He knew that loud reactions often fed the very behavior they were meant to stop. Across the room, someone noticed his stillness. They watched him closely, expecting something. An argument, perhaps. An excuse, a quick exit. But none came. He shifted slightly and moved toward an empty corner, not to hide, but to give himself space. From there, he could see almost everyone. He noticed how the laughter continued, how people moved from one topic to another without care. The group that had mocked him seemed encouraged by the lack of response. Their comments grew bolder, testing boundaries. They spoke as if he were not there, as if he were an object rather than a person. He listened, breathing slowly, grounding himself in the moment. He reminded himself that this was only one evening, one room, one group of people. It did not define him. As the music paused briefly between songs, the room fell quieter. Someone made another comment about him, louder this time. A few heads turned in his direction. The attention settled on him like a weight. He looked up, meeting the room with steady eyes. He did not smile, but he did not frown either. There was no challenge in his expression, only calm presence. The silence did not last long. Music returned, and conversations resumed, but something had shifted. A few guests now watched him with curiosity rather than amusement. They seemed unsure of what to make of someone who refused to react the way they expected. He stayed until the end of the song, standing quietly, unchanged. The night was still young, and the real test had not yet begun. What no one realized was that this calm presence, this quiet strength, was about to change the entire mood of the party in ways they could not imagine. As the evening went on, the noise in the room increased. Music played louder, glasses clinked, and conversations overlapped so much that it was hard to focus on any single sound. He stayed near the edge of the room, observing as he always did. He noticed the way people moved, the way they laughed, and how they spoke to one another. He noticed that some of the laughter was sharp, almost too loud, as if they wanted someone to notice how funny they were. Soon, he realized that the attention on him had grown. The same group that had whispered earlier was now more open with their remarks. One of them made a comment about his clothes, louder than before. Another smirked and added something about how out of place he seemed. A few others laughed, but it was an uneasy laugh, not a genuine one. The way they spoke, the way they looked at him, made it clear they were trying to embarrass him. He felt a familiar tightness in his chest. The feeling had been there many times before, in classrooms, at work, and even in casual gatherings. He had learned to sit with it, to breathe through it, and not let it control him. So he did what he always did. He took a slow breath and let his shoulders relax. He did not respond. He did not show anger, and he did not walk away. He stayed quiet, letting the room unfold around him. The group's comments grew bolder. One person started imitating his posture in an exaggerated way. Another pointed to the floor, laughing, as if to suggest he belonged there. The words stung, but he kept his face calm. He realized something important. If he reacted in the way they expected, it would only encourage them to continue. His stillness, his calm, was stronger than any argument he could make in the moment. He moved slightly, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He tried to remain visible, not hidden, but also to give himself space. He noticed the small reactions of others in the room. Some looked confused, unsure if they should join in or stop. Some watched silently, curious about how he would respond. It was interesting in a strange way to see how human behavior unfolded when someone refused to react predictably. The mocking continued. Someone started asking him sarcastic questions, questions meant to put him on the spot. Where did he work? What did he do for fun? Who did he know here? All of it was framed to make him feel smaller. People leaned in, waiting for a response, expecting to see embarrassment or irritation in his eyes. He answered calmly, with short, polite sentences. He did not over-explain, did not justify himself. He simply spoke with honesty and clarity. The room seemed to quiet slightly. The mockers looked at each other, unsure why their usual tactics were not working. Their jokes, once sharp and confident, began to falter. Despite his calmness, he could feel the tension rising. Some guests were uncomfortable, shifting in place, avoiding eye contact. Others whispered to each other, clearly trying to decide what to do next. The power in the room had begun to shift, subtly but noticeably. His stillness and polite demeanor created an unexpected pause in the energy of the party.